In basically every application, security is a two-step process. Step one, authenticate the user, prove that they are who they say they are, and then step two, authorize the user, determine what it is that we want the user to be able to do. Now, what we're going to see in SharePoint is that there's a couple of different ways that we can do this. And we're going to start off in this lesson by taking a look at how we can apply permissions at the site level and potentially even down to a list, to a folder, or even to an item level. Now, before we get in and start doing some demonstrations and kind of showing everything off, we do need to define a couple of different terms, talk a bit about the different moving parts that are going to come into play when we're talking about security. So let's define some terminology here. SharePoint security really has three main moving parts. We've got principals, and these are the people or groups to whom we want to grant the permissions. We have securables, and these are the objects that are going to be secured, our sites, our lists, and our items. And then finally, we've got the permissions, and these are the different things that we want our users to be able to do. Now, in SharePoint, what you're going to notice is that we have a bunch of permissions that are available to us. There's 33, in fact. And what's nice about the fact that we've got that many permissions is that it gives us a lot of control over what it is that we want the user, or I guess more importantly, don't want the user to be able to do. The little catch here, however, is that sometimes you may go in, apply permissions, and forget some underlying permission that might be very important for the user to interact with SharePoint. So when it comes to permissions in SharePoint, you want to make sure that you go in and test everything thoroughly to make sure that you've put together the appropriate set of permissions. In SharePoint, you're not allowed to apply permissions directly. Instead, permissions are grouped together into what's known as a permission level. Now, some people will see the term permission level, and they'll immediately start thinking about some form of inheritance or anything like that in SharePoint, and that's actually not the case. Permissions are cumulative, so that if I happen to be a member of a couple of different groups that have a couple of different permission levels assigned to them, I'm going to have all of the permissions from all of those different permission levels. However, there is no inheritance, there is no hierarchy or anything like that with the permission levels. It's just simply the name that Microsoft applied to our permissions that are grouped together. Now, permission levels are very similar to NTFS permissions. So, for example, if I give somebody modify permissions inside of NTFS, what that really is behind the scenes is that's really a group of individual permissions. Just makes it a bit easier for me to apply those by just granting that one global permission as opposed to each of the individual ones. Again, in SharePoint, I'm not going to be able to apply the individual permissions. It's always going to be a group of permissions that are again known as a permission level. Out of the box, Microsoft provides a handful of different permission levels. Now, the permission levels that you're going to see available to you are going to vary based on the template that you choose. That being said, there are a few very common permission levels that you're going to see pretty much universally in every template that you're going to be working with. Now, as far as the built-in permission levels, a couple of best practices here. Number one is whenever possible, use them. That's what they're there for. And what's nice about using the built-in permission levels is that if you have SharePoint power users, if you have SharePoint administrators, they're going to be familiar with the built-in permission levels. So if they see contribute, if they see design, if they see edit, they're going to know exactly what's being applied behind the scenes. While if you create your own custom one, they're maybe going to have to go in and actually look up to see what it is that permission is going to do. Along those same lines, don't ever edit the built-in permission levels. Use them, absolutely, but don't edit them. The problem with editing them is what can happen is somebody could use a permission level, assuming that it's the built-in permission level, then it hasn't been edited, and grant that to a group and wind up granting too many or too few permissions. With the real problem, of course, being too many, because now our users are able to do things that we really didn't want them to do. So use them, but don't edit them. The couple of permission levels that I want to highlight here are, first up, limited access. Now, limited access is a system permission level. And what it's there for is it's to make sure that a user can get down to a child item that I've granted permissions to. So for example, let's say that we had a public PDF inside of a list inside of our HR site. And I want to make sure that everybody has access to this PDF. So what I do is I go to that PDF and I apply the appropriate permissions. The problem, though, is that my user needs to get down to that individual item. So they're going to need some set of permissions that would actually allow them to get to a point where they could open that item. That's where limited access comes into play. So you'll see limited access pop up if you go in and apply permissions to a lower level. This is typically not a permission that you're going to use directly. The next one that we have is read. And what read will allow somebody to do is view pages and download documents. So if you're looking for read-only access, typically this is going to be the permission that I'm looking for. We also have contribute. Now, contribute will give somebody the ability to read items as well as to edit, create, and delete items. The couple of very big things that contribute is not allowed to do is manage, modify lists, manage, modify the site structure, and manage permissions. Now, a new permission level is edit. Edit is contribute, but with the ability to edit and manage lists. So if you want to give somebody the ability to create lists and to modify a bit of the structure in SharePoint, then you're going to want to grant edit. Now, if you want to give somebody the ability to actually customize the site, apply themes, etc., then you're going to want design. The big thing that design is not able to do is modify permissions. That is where full control comes into play. That with full control, the user is going to be able to do whatever it is that they might want to do. Let's take a look at how to set up a permission level. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my intranet site here. So let me just fire up Internet Explorer. And we'll let this launch. And let's log on with Windows authentication here. Okay. So now I'm ready to set up my permission level. So I'm going to click on the gear in the upper right-hand corner, hit the little drop down, and say Site Settings. And then right over here, I've got my site permissions. So I'm just going to click that. And you're going to notice that we now get the list of all the different groups that are available to us. Up towards the top, you're going to notice our permission levels. So I'm going to click that, and then there is all of the permission levels. Let's imagine that what I want to be able to do is I want to give somebody the ability to create items and read them, but not edit or delete them. That maybe I'm setting up a calendar. And on this calendar, I want people to be able to put something on to there, maybe have some form of an approval workflow, but I don't want them to be able to delete items off of there, that maybe there's a different workflow that needs to be walked through. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a permission level that's built in that just gives us the ability to create and read. So I'm going to need to go in and create one on my own. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Add a Permission Level. And I'm going to give this a very clever name of Create and Read. And then under the description, allows for the creation and reading of items. No edit or delete permissions are applied. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll on down and I'm going to start choosing the permissions that I'm looking for. So for example, I'm going to be looking for add items. So I'm just going to put the little check right there. Now you'll notice that when I say add items, that SharePoint will automatically put a check next to view items. The reason that we need view items is because we have the ability to create a unique column. And so if I'm going to create a unique column in a list, SharePoint needs to figure out whether or not I have violated that uniqueness constraint. And it's going to need to go in and actually do all the different reading there. So it'll automatically select view items. So I have my add, and I'm also going to say open items. So we'll put the check right there. And I'm just going to keep scrolling down here. Now you're also going to notice that we've got view application pages. This is typically a permission that we are going to need to apply because this will allow our users to be able to see forms and see views that have been created. So typically we're going to want a check there. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to hit another very important one, which is to use client integration features. What my client integration features will allow is for somebody to actually create items from, say, Word, Office, Excel, etc. So if you want to be able to save directly, that's the permission you're going to want to apply. If you leave that off, then the only way the user is going to have to be able to create a brand new item is go to the SharePoint site and upload it manually. So now I'm going to scroll the rest of the way down, and I'm going to hit Create. And now we've got our brand new permission level. Now in a later demo, we're going to go and apply it, but for right now, we've got our permission level created. So now, let's go ahead and take a look at how to set up our groups. So back to the slides. Principals. Principals are our users and groups that we're going to be granting our permissions from. Now, users and groups can come from outside of SharePoint, and they'll come from the authentication provider. And this could basically be from anywhere. That this could be from Active Directory, this could be from forms-based authentication, this could be some OAuth custom implementation that we're going to be getting our users and our groups from. Now, what's very nice about SharePoint is that on the whole, where the user or where the group is actually coming from doesn't really matter, that I can still access and use them the exact same way. So it makes management of all of this much easier for me, that our authorization is separate from the authentication. So if the authentication mechanism changes, we don't need to make changes to our authorization mechanisms. Now we also have the ability at the SharePoint level to create groups. Groups inside of SharePoint are just like, well, groups anywhere else. That it's going to be a group of users or it's going to be a group of groups. Now, one of the very big things to keep in mind about SharePoint groups is that these are created at the site level and they do inherit down the hierarchy. So if I create a group in the top site, that will flow down to all of the child sites unless I turn off or block inheritance. Now, just like before, we've got a couple of different types of SharePoint groups. We've got the custom ones that we're going to create, and then we also have the built-in ones. And also, just like our permission levels, you want to use the built-in ones whenever possible. You don't want to edit them, and they will vary depending on the site template that you've chosen. Now, one of the big questions that arises whenever we start talking about SharePoint groups is, who do we want to put inside of a SharePoint group? Do we want to put users inside of groups, or do we want to put groups inside of groups? And the answer, as is true with a lot of SharePoint, is it really depends on your environment. That what's nice about putting users into SharePoint groups is that it allows for autonomy. It allows for delegation of control. That what I can do is I can put maybe different managers, maybe different power users in charge of different spots inside of SharePoint, and they can apply permissions by just going in, grabbing the users, and putting them into the groups. That I don't need to grant them any special permissions to Active Directory. I don't need to create any form of a special tool or give them training on how to go manage things inside of Active Directory. So it allows for a more autonomous environment. On top of that, one of the big considerations is how SharePoint is going to behave as far as the UI goes. That if I take an Active Directory group and I put that into SharePoint, when I go look at the group members, the SharePoint group members, all that I'm going to see is what I've put into the SharePoint group. In other words, if I put an Active Directory group into a SharePoint group, if I open up that SharePoint group, I'm going to see the AD group. I'm not going to see the individual users inside of there. And so that can make it a little bit more challenging to figure out exactly who's a member of that SharePoint group. Now, while all that's well and good, again, your choice here is going to depend. There are advantages to using Active Directory groups. That if you have an environment where things are centrally managed, that the people that are going to be managing SharePoint are the same ones that are going to be managing Active Directory, and this is quite common in smaller environments, then what I can do is I can use my Active Directory groups. What's nice about using the Active Directory groups is that chances are they've already been created. I can manage permissions then, I being the administrator, without having to go into SharePoint, that I can just go straight to Active Directory users and computers, add and remove people from the groups, and away we go from there. So, as far as which it is that you should choose, the answer is going to depend on your environment. Now, if you're going to pin me down and say, hey, well, give me a starting point, give me a default value, if you will, I would say that my default value is I prefer users inside of SharePoint groups, that I find that that fits most SharePoint implementations, that I find that most of the time what you're looking for is some level of autonomy. One of the things that's worth noting, and definitely a tick in the advantages column to using Active Directory for managing your groups, is nesting. You are not able to nest a SharePoint group inside of another SharePoint group. But of course, you do have the ability to nest your Active Directory groups. And that can, in certain situations, in certain larger enterprises, help ease your security management. Our built-in SharePoint groups, again, are going to vary depending on the template that we choose. The typical ones that you're going to see, first up is owners. Owners are going to have the full control permission level applied to them. Next up is our members. Now, this is a pretty big change from 2007 and 2010. And it's subtle, but it's very important. In 2010 and in 2007, members were granted the contribute permission by default. And the big thing that contribute is not allowed to do is manage lists. That changes in 2013. In 2013, the default permission level applied to our members is edit. And edit not only gives you the ability to manage items, but it gives you the ability to manage lists. So you will want to pay very close attention to that. Last but not least, we get visitors, and visitors have read access. One little thing to note about visitors and read access is the fact that they are able to download items. So this is not just simply being able to view pages inside of SharePoint. This is going to allow them to actually download items. Let's go in, create a group, and add people to our group. Let's go back to Internet Explorer, and let's hit Site Settings, and back to our site permissions. And here is the list of our groups. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Create Group, and I'm going to give this a name, and I'm going to call this Content contributors. And on the About Me, I'm going to go ahead and say members can create and read items, but not edit. Now, if I scroll down, you're going to notice that we've got a couple of different options here. The first set of options is who's allowed to view and modify group membership. Now, on the view side of things, the default is group members, but I can, if I wanted to, allow everyone to see who's a member of a group. The next option is who's allowed to edit the group. Now, by default, you have to be an owner of the group, or you would need to have permissions to modify permissions in order to actually modify the membership here. But you're also going to notice that I could put the little dot next to group members. And you might be wondering, well, why in the world would I ever want to allow a member of a group to modify the membership of said group? Well, again, it all goes back to autonomy. One of my favorite little features in SharePoint is using SharePoint to manage meetings. So what you do is you create a little site, and you put all the information that's needed for that meeting inside of there, and then you invite people into that little site. So that way, in advance of the meeting, they can read and get up to date on all the different documents and all the different things that we're going to be discussing in said meeting. So that way, in theory anyway, everybody goes into the meeting actually educated on what it is that we're going to talk about. So that way we can actually save some time and get some work done. Now, in that type of an environment, I'm going to want basically anybody to go off and create a meeting workspace. And I'm also going to want to make sure that people can invite others. So let's say, for example, that I realize I've been invited to this meeting, and I realize, hey, you know what? Steve should really join this meeting as well. Now, I don't necessarily want to give everybody the ability to manage permissions on the entire site. But if I allow group members to modify the membership of the group, then what could happen is if that's been granted to me, I can now invite Steve without needing the ability to modify all of the entire site permissions. So I go in, I create the group, I go ahead and I say, all right, well, group members can now invite other people. So anybody inside of there could invite anybody else that needs to be invited. Again, it's all about autonomy. Now, SharePoint also allows for people to request membership inside of a group. And so you can decide whether or not you want to allow for that to happen. You can decide whether or not you want to automatically accept those requests as well. And again, it's just about that whole autonomy thing, that maybe I've got a site that's set up that has just some basic information, and I want basically anybody to be able to join in. Then I could go ahead and set up something like that. And so now I'm going to scroll down, and it's going to ask me, okay, well, what permission level do you want to apply? And I'm going to put my little check next to create and read, and then I'm going to hit create. Now you'll notice that it will automatically put me into the group since I've created it. I'm going to go ahead and clear that out. Don't really want to be inside of there, so I'm just going to put my little check and just say remove users and say OK. And now I'm going to add somebody in. So I'm going to hit my little drop down. We'll say add users. And you'll notice it'll say enter names, email addresses, or everyone. And I'm going to say D. Baxter and hit enter. And give this just a moment to go look that up. It found Dave Baxter for me, so I'll go ahead and choose Dave, and I'm going to hit share. And now that will allow Dave to be able to create and read items, but not edit items. Now, one other little button while I'm here that I want to highlight is the share button right up top. Now, what the share button will allow me to do is this will allow me to quote-unquote share the team site. That whoever it is that I put inside of here will then automatically get the edit permission. They'll automatically wind up inside of members. And you'll notice that if I just kind of mouse over, it'll tell me a little bit about that permission as well. So that's another way that you can very easily grant edit permissions. Permissions in SharePoint inherit from parent to child. So if I create a site, Any permissions that are there, as well as any groups, will flow down to the child site, and in turn they're going to flow down to the list, and in turn they're going to flow down to folders, and in turn from there they're going to flow down to individual items. This helps make my life that much easier. Now, one very big thing to keep in mind, and I know I've said this quite a bit before, but it's worth reiterating one last time, and that is that permissions do not flow between site collections. Now, you can, if you want, turn off inheritance. Before we get into the specifics of how to do this and the ramifications of this, I want to right away stress you want to avoid doing this. A, because it's going to make my life more difficult, that I then have to go in, block the inheritance, and now if I apply permissions to the parent, one of the things that we're going to talk about is the fact that those permissions are no longer going to flow down because we've blocked inheritance. So it's going to make my life more challenging. On top of that, SharePoint does this little thing called security trimming, meaning that if I don't have permissions to an item, SharePoint's not going to show it to me, and that's a good thing. The problem with that, though, is that there's no magic there. In order for that to work, SharePoint has to go in and read all of the permissions. And if you've got a bunch of individual permissions that are being applied, that is going to slow things down. So as much as possible, take advantage of inheritance. Now, if you decide to disable inheritance, what's going to happen is you're now going to set up unique permissions for the level in which you blocked inheritance. In other words, if I go to a list and I tell that list to stop inheriting, I can now do individual permissions for that list. Now, no permissions from that point forward are going to be inherited. Which means, again, that if I apply brand new permissions to the parent, and I have a list that's blocked inheritance, those permissions are not going to flow down to that list. So a couple of best practices here. Number one, again, take advantage of inheritance whenever possible. Number two, limit breaking inheritance makes it more difficult to manage, degrades performance, and quite simply, it's just easier to make mistakes. Now, that being said, there may be times when I need to go in and break inheritance. That maybe I've got an HR site, and on this HR site, we've got maybe some private information that we don't want anybody else to be able to see. So what I could do is I could go in and break inheritance on the list that contains this private information, and then only give that to the people who need to be able to access that. Or I can go the other direction as well. That, let's say, again, I've got that HR site, and there's just one list that needs to be public. Maybe it's a time off calendar. So what I could do is I could go to that calendar, block inheritance, and then give more permissions as needed. Let's take a look at how we could modify permissions. I'm going to go back to Internet Explorer here. And I'm going to go to my little documents list here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Library. And then over here on the right-hand side, I've got a couple little icons that I can click on. One of them is Library Settings, and that will take me to the Settings page from which I can modify permissions. But you're also going to notice there's a little hero button right here that will allow me to modify the permissions on this list. Now, it's called Shared With if you mouse over it, but it's going to all be about permissions. So if I click that, you're going to notice that it's going to show me everybody that this is shared with. And you'll also notice that if I go to Advanced, that I now get the permission screen. Now, from this permission screen, what I can do is I can modify the permissions once I turn off inheritance. And I can do that by just clicking Stop Inheriting Permissions. Now, it's going to give me the little warning saying, hey, are you sure you want to do this? And then I can say OK. Now, from here, if I decide that I want to turn inheritance back on, Then I'm going to click Delete Unique Permissions. That will re-enable inheritance. It'll also get rid of any of the permissions that I've applied, but it will re-enable inheritance. If I want to apply different permissions, then I click Grant Permissions. And then what you're going to notice is that if I hit the little options button, that I could choose a particular person, group, or otherwise. Let's go ahead and just grab Dave again. And then down at the very bottom, then I can choose the permission level that I want to grant. So if I want to give Dave full control over the documents, then I could go ahead and say full control, and I can hit share. And so now, to that list, and only that list, Dave would now have full control. There's how to manage permissions in SharePoint. I'm going to see you in the next lesson.